It would be controversial if, in the famous movie Saving Private Ryan, a group of American Marines ruthlessly violated German, French, or Japanese women, wouldn't it? In the collective imagination, the American soldiers who fought against Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire were immaculate and heroic. However, recent investigations claim that many of these men raped hundreds of thousands of women during and after World War II. These silenced crimes are beginning to be revisited, revealing horrifying truths such as the systematic rape of women, including minors. In today's video, we will tell you about the horrendous war crimes committed by American soldiers against the women they were supposed to rescue. Get ready for an especially strong and impactful installment of military history. Let's begin. While Nazi crimes are logically the most remembered of World War II, the Allied forces also committed atrocities. Among them stands out the sadistic mistreatment of raped, and in some cases, murdered women in multiple sexual crimes during D-Day and the occupation of Germany and Japan. Wartime secret archives made public only in 2006 reveal that American soldiers committed more than 400 rapes in Europe between 1942 and 1945. However, another study estimates that a total of 14,000 civilian women in France and Germany were raped by American soldiers during World War II. Nevertheless, both sets of data seem to be far from the truth, as many American rapes in Germany in 1945 were group rapes committed by armed soldiers at gunpoint, and women were afraid to even speak about it. The legal branch of the Army was reluctant to confirm the rumors, but admitted that, for brutal or perverted sexual crimes against German women, some soldiers had been executed. This was more common if the soldiers were black. A typical form of war crime involving sexual assault by American personnel, usually drunk, marching through occupied territory, involved threatening a German family with weapons, forcing one or more women into sadistic and brutal sexual acts, and then dragging the entire family onto the street to steal their belongings. Although non-fraternization policies were instituted for Americans in Germany, the U.S. Army troops used the phrase, "fornication without conversation is not fraternization," as a motto. Let's begin by recounting what happened during the occupation of Berlin when the Nazis were defeated. German families were terrified of the arrival of Soviet troops because stories of systematic rapes by the Red Army spread quickly between German towns and cities. American soldiers, however, were welcomed as liberators, and propaganda has marked the German collective imagination with the image of the American friend as an occupying soldier who did not commit war crimes. Nevertheless, the reality was completely different. This account, as told by the following specialist, was largely based on social pressure.
A woman who told of a rape by a Red Army soldier could expect some degree of acceptance or empathy. Whereas a woman who said she'd been raped by a GI was fairly often labeled as one of those who would throw themselves willingly at the Western occupiers.
During the spring of 1945, American troops took one town after another in different German regions. In most of them, they not only encountered no resistance, but were even greeted with American flags in the streets. They would then set up in the town hall and prepare for a house-to-house inspection. The troops conducted an initial search for enemy combatants, weapons, and Nazi refugees. Once it was confirmed that there was no danger, looting began. These cruel soldiers seized watches, bicycles, radios, sunglasses, jewelry, and any valuable items they found in houses. Finally, before leaving, they would rape women and girls in a sadistic and brutal manner, bidding farewell. Neither the remaining German administration nor the occupying troops kept any records of the atrocious rapes. Most of the documented evidence has been found in reports compiled by the church at that time. The Archbishop of Munich urged priests from all towns to keep a detailed record of the activities of foreign armies in the region and their effects on the communities. Some of these records preserved in Munich include entries by Michael Merksmüller, the parish priest of the town of Ramsau, who wrote on July 20th, 1945, 8 girls and women raped, some of them in the presence of their parents. Father Alois Schimmel of Moosburg wrote on August 1st, 1945, by order of the military government, a list of all residents and their ages must be posted on the door of each house. As a result of this decree, 17 girls and women have had to be taken to the hospital after being repeatedly sexually abused by American troops. According to these ecclesiastical records, the youngest victim was a 7-year-old girl who contracted a serious venereal disease, while the oldest was a 69-year-old woman. This is just evidence of the soldiers' brutal and inhumane behavior, who had no military justification for behaving like wild beasts. The Americans did as they pleased, without hindrance or any control, not even bothering to hide their crimes. This is recounted in a German report and the testimony of a victim.
2 American soldiers raped a very respectable girl. They forced their way into the house at night on the pretense of having orders to search the premises. Actually, they had been looking for girls.
And then I was raped by one of them. He dragged me into an old tavern. What could I have done? He had a pistol, so woe to me if I'd struggle or scream. This was in the daytime. They would just grab a girl, drag her somewhere, and that was that.
Often, American troops asked local authorities for female personnel, groups of women, supposedly to assist in secretarial or kitchen tasks. It was a type of forced labor that often masked indiscriminate rape. The groups of women rotated and were replaced every 15 days. When they returned home, they kept silent about what happened, with a huge sense of guilt. The women simply accepted what happened to them. They knew they didn't have much choice. In their view, they belonged to the losing side of the war and somehow had to accept these aberrations as punishment. This is why the number of rapes committed by American troops is difficult to quantify. The shame and pain of the victims have prevented them from reporting the incidents in peace. This criminal, systematic and atrocious behavior extended to unusual places. Soldiers exchanged information about which houses had defenseless women and children. Rapes were the most traumatic acts that the troops perpetrated against women. But that was not all. Hospital reports documented the brutality. In addition to being raped, many women were whipped with lashes and whips, or attacked with blunt weapons. There are almost no testimonies of these atrocities, but the writer Ursula Herking left a chilling account of her own experience in her autobiography.
The first one took me a few yards away from the road. The others watched. It took 4 minutes. I had been looking at my watch. Then the next one came. I thought, goodness me, I hope I don't get pregnant. Goodness me, I hope I don't catch venereal disease. Please, no, no. Then I marched on.
After the first months of the post-war period, during which these abuses were rampant, other types of sexual acts proliferated, where the consent boundary became much more blurred. The hunger and hardships left by the conflict led many German women to prostitute themselves for just a few provisions that often fed a family. American propaganda promoted the idea that German women were attracted to American troops, serving as a misogynistic argument for the criminally called excesses. While the post-war period left atrocities scattered throughout German territory, the behavior of American GIs was condemnable even before the war ended. From D-Day onward and the deployment of American troops in Europe, there were rapes in all French cities where American soldiers were stationed. The first officially recorded sexual crime took place just a few weeks after the landing. The perpetrators of the rapes were generally not frontline fighters, but members of logistical support units. The explanation seems simple. Soldiers not directly involved in combat had more free time and were subject to less discipline. The stereotypes explaining the American imagination that had permeated the fighters came from World War I. France was presented in the military magazine Stars and Stripes as a great house of prostitutes, an eroticized country whose women were beautiful, welcoming, and demonstrative. These stereotypes had been generated among the veterans of the Great War of 1914, whose exaggerated erotic adventures in French lands were passed down from generation to generation. In the minds of American war rapists in France, the act of sexual crime was not about humiliating the enemy's women or punishing an inferior people. Rape was, rather, a reward for having liberated them. These criminal behaviors in American troops were supposedly punished by the authorities. But experts say it was all part of a great farce, and only a small fraction of the rapes were actually reported.
It began only 14 days or so after the invasion. In France, the number of rapes that were reported, I'm going to stick with that procedure, were only 182 that were reported.
Between 1944 and 1945, 29 soldiers were publicly executed for the crime of rape, of which 25 were black. Since only the guillotine was used in France, the United States Army brought in an executioner from Texas, a specialist in hangings. It was clear that the prevailing racism in the United States was reflected in the decisions of military courts. For the same crime, a black soldier was always sentenced much more harshly, as another specialist recounts.
Back then, the American judiciary at home tended to rate a sexual assault by a black man on a white woman as particularly outrageous.
On the other hand, when the accuser accused a white soldier, normally the investigation was less rigorous or even non-existent. General Eisenhower himself ordered that the executions be public, on-site, and attended by the victims, their families, and neighbors. He sought to calm the wave of protests that began to flood the press at the time and silence the rumors of the atrocities his soldiers were committing. Of course, specialist historians assert that the vast majority of victims never filed a complaint. Rapes and sexual crimes did not only occur on European soil. In early 1945, American troops were already landing on Japanese territory, and by August of that same year, after the nuclear attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered and Allied occupation troops occupied the main islands. The takeover of the territory ended in most of Japan on April 28, 1952, but until then, the atrocities committed by the American Army were truly indefensible. While there is no concrete evidence that Allied troops committed massive rapes during the Pacific War, there are numerous testimonies alleging that U.S. forces committed an untold number of sexual crimes during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945 and the subsequent occupation. One of the many examples that stand out is what happened in a town on the Japanese peninsula of Motobu after the landing. At that time, the village only had women, children, and the elderly, as all young men had been mobilized for the war. Shortly after their arrival, the Marines swept the entire village but found no signs of Japanese forces. Taking advantage of the population's vulnerability, they organized a macabre and sinister game. They began hunting women in broad daylight. As if it were a hunting day, they sought out all those hiding in the village or in nearby air raid shelters, dragged them by the hair, and then brutally raped them without any mercy. Another example of the ferocity of the Allied troops is given by the testimony of an innocent and young American soldier, compatriot of the rapists. Marching south, men of the 4th Marine Infantry passed by a group of about 10 American Marines, gathered in a closed circle by the roadside. They were quite lively, observed a corporal who assumed they were playing dice. Later, as they passed by them, the surprised young man recounted that he could see they were taking turns raping an Asian woman. The corporal intended to intervene, but his team continued to advance as if nothing unusual was happening. The complicit silence of the American troops is partly responsible for many of these stories not being known, and the statistics cleanse the image of a military force that was clearly, at least in part, criminal. The most distressing thing is that women not only suffered at the hands of enemy soldiers, but also from their own imperial troops. In this heartbreaking testimony, a comfort woman, as women systematically raped by Japanese soldiers